A different kind of trail. The most successful explorers in human history never intended to leave home. Picture a world where the air tastes like damp earth and wood smoke, where the silence is so heavy it feels like a physical weight against your eardrums. You are standing on the edge of a vast, golden savanna in the Rift Valley, 300,000 years ago. The grass brushes against your thighs, dry and abrasive, smelling of sun-baked hay and distant rain. To you, the horizon isn't a destination. It is a boundary, a flickering line of heat haze that marks the end of everything you know. You aren't a pioneer, and you aren't a conqueror. You are a hungry primate with a family to feed and a constant, gnawing need for water. Every step you take away from the familiar trees is a gamble with your life, a slow-motion dance with predators that can run twice as fast as you can. And yet, somehow, that slow, cautious shuffle across the dirt would eventually lead your descendants to the frozen tundra of the Arctic and the sun-drenched islands of the Pacific. It wasn't a sprint or a grand march. It was a rhythmic, relentless expansion that happened one valley at a time, driven by the simple, terrifying reality that staying still was the only thing more dangerous than moving. But how does a creature designed for the shade of the forest end up owning the entire planet? The answer begins not with a map, but with the salt on your skin. Imagine the heat of the midday sun pressing down on your shoulders like a hot iron. In this environment, every other large mammal is a ticking time bomb of thermal failure. A lion or a cheetah can explode into a blur of lethal speed, but within minutes, their internal temperature spikes to the point of brain damage. They have to stop. They have to pant. They have to hide in the shadows and wait for the world to cool down. But you don't. You feel the trickle of moisture down your spine, the evaporative cooling of 2 million sweat glands working in perfect unison. This is your engine. You are a biological radiator, a machine built to dissipate heat while in motion. While the rest of the animal kingdom is paralyzed by the sun, you are still moving. It is a slow, steady, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of calloused feet on hard-packed clay. Your stride is a masterpiece of efficiency, aided by a nuchal ligament at the base of your skull that keeps your head perfectly level while your body swings underneath it like a pendulum. You are essentially a walking spring, using your Achilles tendon to store energy with every footfall and release it with the next. In 2004, researchers Dennis Bramble and Daniel Lieberman published a landmark study in the journal Nature, arguing that our entire anatomy, from our springy arches to our massive gluteus maximus, was sculpted by the need for endurance running. We didn't hunt by being faster, we hunted by being more persistent. We walked our prey into heat stroke, following them through the shimmering heat until they simply fell over, their hearts unable to keep up with our steady, sweating pace. But does a body built for the savanna truly have what it takes to cross a mountain range? Think about the first time a human stood at the base of the Himalayas or the Alps. The air turns thin and biting, smelling of ancient ice and pulverized stone. The vibrant greens of the lowlands fade into a monochromatic world of gray rock and blinding white snow. Your breath comes in ragged, shallow gasps, blooming like white ghosts in the freezing air. This is a landscape that wants to kill you, a place where gravity and cold conspire to stop your progress. Yet, the archaeological record shows that we didn't just bypass these barriers, we embraced them. We find stone tools in high-altitude caves in the Tibetan Plateau dating back over 30,000 years. These weren't temporary hunting camps, these were homes. We adapted. Our blood changed, developing the ability to carry more oxygen through our veins. We learned to stitch the skins of the animals we followed into heavy, insulating cloaks, creating a portable microclimate that we carried on our backs. The journey was no longer just about the body, it was about the tools. We became the first species to carry our environment with us, a trick that allowed a tropical primate to survive in a world of ice. We pushed through the mountain passes not because we wanted to see the other side, but because the goats we hunted moved that way, and we were tied to them by the invisible cord of hunger. Can a creature of the earth ever truly belong to the wind and the cold? Then the land ended. Imagine standing on a beach in what is now Indonesia 65,000 years ago. The air is thick with the scent of salt spray and rotting kelp, and the sound of the surf is a rhythmic, booming thunder that vibrates in your chest. For 300,000 years, the ocean had been a wall, a vast, blue nothingness that swallowed anyone who ventured too far. But something changed. Perhaps it was a freak tsunami that dragged a family out to sea on a mat of floating vegetation, or perhaps it was the simple observation of a coconut drifting on the tide. Whatever the spark, humans began to look at the water not as a grave, but as a bridge. We have no surviving boats from this era. Wood and reed are swallowed by time. But we have something better, the evidence of arrival. On the island of Flores, archaeologists found stone tools that are 800,000 years old. These belonged to an earlier human relative, Homo floresiensis, often called the Hobbit. To get to Flores, even at the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age, you had to cross at least 12 miles of deep, treacherous open ocean with currents strong enough to sweep a modern swimmer away. They didn't drift there by accident. They crossed the Wallace Line, a deep-water trench that has separated the faunas of Asia and Australia for millions of years. This means that nearly a million years before the first sail was ever hoisted, a human ancestor looked at a distant, hazy island and decided to build something that could float. Is it possible that the ocean was never a BA? The true mastery of the sea, however, belongs to the voyagers who settled the Sahul, the ancient landmass that once connected Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania. 65,000 years ago, a group of people stood on the shores of Southeast Asia and looked toward a horizon they could not see past. Australia was not visible from the mainland. There were no birds leading the way, no plumes of smoke on the horizon. To make that crossing, you had to trust in the physics of a raft and the consistency of the stars. It required a level of planning and cooperation that is almost impossible to grasp. You needed to gather bamboo or logs, lash them together with vines, and provide enough fresh water and food for a journey of unknown duration. The crossing to Australia was at least 50 miles of open sea. It was a leap of faith into a blue void. When they finally hit the red sand of the Australian coast, they weren't just migrants, they were the world's first true mariners. They brought with them a complex culture, a deep understanding of the stars, and a language that would eventually branch into hundreds of distinct tongues. They moved across the Australian interior with a speed that defies logic, reaching the southern tip of the continent in just a few thousand years. They did this by mapping the landscape through song and story, creating songlines that acted as oral GPS systems, allowing them to navigate thousands of miles of desert by memorizing the features of the land. But what happens when the desert is made of ice instead of sand? Picture the biting, metallic taste of a Siberian winter 30,000 years ago. The wind screams across the steppe, carrying needles of ice that scour your skin. In this world, movement is a form of survival. If you stop, you freeze. This was the frontier of the Bering Land Bridge, a vast, grassy plain that once connected Russia to Alaska. The people who moved across this bridge weren't migrating in the way we think of it today. They were following the mammoth. They were living in a world of bone and fur, building their homes from the ribs of the giants they killed and burning their dung for warmth. The ground beneath their feet was permafrost, a hard, unforgiving surface that echoed with the sound of their footsteps. They moved in small family bands, perhaps 20 or 30 people, trailing the great herds across a landscape that was constantly shifting as the glaciers advanced and retreated. There were no landmarks here, only the stars and the behavior of the animals. When they finally crossed into the Americas, they found a continent that had never seen a human footprint. They moved south with breathtaking speed, reaching the tip of South America in a fraction of the time it took their ancestors to leave Africa. They weren't just walking, they were flowing, like water filling a basin, adapting their technology and their culture to every new climate they encountered. But how do you carry a world's worth of supplies when you have nothing but your own strength? The limitation of the human body is weight. You can walk for 1,000 miles, but you can only carry what your shoulders can bear. For most of our history, this meant our possessions were few and our lives were light. But then we found a partner. Imagine the smell of wet fur and the sound of a low, rumbling growl in the darkness outside your firelight. 30,000 years ago, in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, we began a relationship that would change the logistics of travel forever. The wolf became the dog. This wasn't a master-slave relationship, it was a biological merger. We provided the scraps and the fire, they provided the nose and the muscle. In the Arctic, This partnership reached its zenith. We built sleds of bone and frozen hide, and we harnessed the power of the pack. A team of 6 dogs could move hundreds of pounds of gear across the ice at speeds no human could ever match. Suddenly, the impossible distances of the north became manageable. We could carry our tents, our fuel, and our children. We could move as a village, not just as a hunting party. The dog was our first engine, a self-replicating, fuel-burning machine that allowed us to conquer the most inhospitable environments on Earth. We see the evidence of this in the archaeological sites of the Zhokhov Island in the high Russian Arctic, where 8,000-year-old remains of specialized sled dogs were found alongside the remnants of sophisticated sled runners. Does a partner in the hunt eventually become a partner in the soul? As the ice began to retreat and the world warmed, the nature of travel shifted again. The grass of the Eurasian steppe grew tall and thick, a green ocean that stretched from the Danube to the Yellow River. In this environment, a new power emerged. Imagine the thunder of hooves and the Butai culture of modern-day Kazakhstan. Humans did something that would shrink the world by a factor of 10. They climbed onto the back of a horse. This was a revolution of perspective. For 300,000 years, a human's eyes were 6 feet off the ground, moving at 3 miles an hour. On a horse, you were 8 feet tall and moving at 30. You could see over the tall grass. You could outrun the storm. You could reach the next watering hole in hours instead of days. The horse didn't just move people, it moved ideas. It allowed for the first true empires, the first long-distance trade networks, and the first lightning-fast wars. We find the evidence of this in the wear marks on ancient horse teeth, microscopic grooves left by the friction of a bit. We find it in the chemical signatures of mare's milk in pottery shards. The horse turned the vast, empty spaces of the continent into a highway. It made the world feel small for the very first time. But can a creature of speed ever truly understand the value of the slow, steady path? While the horse was conquering the land, a different kind of miracle was happening in the middle of the Pacific. Imagine the feel of a double-hulled canoe lifting on a massive ocean swell, the wood groaning under the tension of fiber lashings. Around 3,000 years ago, the Lapita people began an expansion that makes the moon landing look like a weekend trip. They sailed out into the largest body of water on the planet in vessels made of stone-tooled wood and woven leaves. They had no compass, no sextant, and no charts. Instead, they read the world. They felt the refraction of waves against distant islands through the hulls of their boats. They watched the color of the undersides of clouds, looking for the faint green tint that signaled a hidden lagoon. They followed the flight paths of fairy terns and frigate birds. They memorized the rising and setting points of hundreds of stars. This was wayfinding, a system of navigation so sophisticated that it allowed them to find tiny specks of land thousands of miles apart with pinpoint accuracy. They reached Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand, carrying with them entire ecosystems of plants and animals. They weren't just traveling, they were terraforming the Pacific. When you stand on the beach at Rapa Nui and look out at the endless blue, you are looking at the final frontier of human expansion. They didn't get there by accident. They got there because they had turned the ocean into a map that they alone could read. How does a mind learn to see a path where there is only water? But there was one invention that we often think of as the beginning of travel, when in reality, it was almost the end. Imagine the sound of a heavy, solid wooden disc groaning as it turns on a greased axle for the very first time. The wheel is often cited as the greatest invention in history, but for the traveler, it was a latecomer. We had already walked to the tip of South America, sailed to Australia, and crossed the Bering Strait before anyone thought to put a cart on a road. The oldest known wheel, found in the Ljubljana marshes of Slovenia, dates back only about 5,200 years. For most of human history, the wheel was useless. It required roads, and roads required a level of social organization that didn't exist for most of our tenure on this planet. The wheel didn't help you cross a mountain or a swamp, it only helped you cross the flat, dry spaces between cities. It was the invention of the state, not the invention of the explorer. It turned travel into transportation. It took the wild, unpredictable journey and turned it into a predictable, scheduled movement of goods and tax revenue. The first paved roads in Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley weren't built for explorers. They were built for grain carts and armies. We had already conquered the world on our own 2 feet. The wheel just allowed us to start charging for the trip. Could it be that the tools we think of as progress are actually just the things that keep us from the earth? This brings us to the most overlooked piece of the puzzle, the burden. Imagine the strain in your lower back as you drag a 100-pound carcass of a deer across a mile of scrubland. For most of our history, the limit on our expansion wasn't how far we could walk, but how much we could bring back. We solved this with the travois, 2 long poles lashed together in a V-shape, dragged behind the person or a dog. This simple frame turned the friction of the earth into a tool. It allowed a single person to move double their body weight. We see the legacy of this in the worn paths of the Great Plains and the ancient trade routes of the Sahara. These weren't just tracks. They were deep, sunken grooves in the earth, carved by millions of tons of goods dragged across the continent over thousands of years. Before the road, there was the trace. These traces followed the paths of least resistance, the ridgelines where the snow melted first, the river crossings where the bottom was firm, the gaps in the mountains where the wind was less fierce. We didn't build these paths, we inherited them from the animals, and then we wore them deep into the bone of the planet. Even today, many of our major highways follow the exact same routes used by bison and the humans who trailed them 10,000 years ago. Is a highway anything more than a memory of a hunt? As you sit in your climate-controlled room today, the world feels incredibly small. You can look at a satellite map of a mountain range you will never visit and zoom in until you see the individual trees. You can book a flight to the other side of the planet and be there before your body has even adjusted to the new time zone. We have solved the problem of distance so completely that we have forgotten it was ever a problem. We treat travel as an inconvenience, a commute, a delay between point A and point B. But for the vast majority of our time on this planet, travel was the point. It was the process of becoming human. It was the way we learned the secrets of the plants, the moods of the weather, and the layout of the stars. Every time you step outside and feel the rhythm of your own gait, you are tapping into a 300,000-year-old legacy of endurance and curiosity. You are a member of the only species that ever looked at a mountain and thought, "I wonder what's on the other side," and then actually went to check. We are the walkers, the voyagers, and the dreamers who refuse to stay in the shade. Could there be a more profound way to honor that legacy than to simply keep moving? The true scale of this journey is almost impossible to fathom when viewed through the lens of a single life. We tend to think of history in terms of years and decades, but the story of how we moved is written in the slow, agonizing pace of generations. It took us nearly 200,000 years just to find the exit out of Africa. We spent more time standing on the shores of the Red Sea, looking at the water, than the entire duration of recorded civilization. We are a species that takes the long way around. We didn't colonize the world, we seeped into it, filling every crack and crevice like a rising tide. And we did it all without a single piece of metal, a single drop of fuel, or a single written word. We did it with the sweat on our brows, the stories in our heads, and the calluses on our feet. We are the product of 1,000,000 miles of walking, 1,000,000 nights under the stars, and 1,000,000 leaps of faith into the dark. Think back to those Litoli footprints in Tanzania, the ones Mary Leakey found preserved in volcanic ash. They are 3.6 million years old. They show 2 people walking together, their strides overlapping, their toes digging into the soft, gray muck. When you look at those prints, you aren't looking at a primitive ancestor, you are looking at yourself. The arch of the foot, the spacing of the toes, the weight of the heel, it is all identical. We have been ready for this journey for millions of years. The only thing that changed was our willingness to finally let go of the shore. We think we are so different from those people in the ash, so much more advanced and so much faster. We think we have conquered the world because we can fly over it. But the world is still there, vast and ancient and indifferent to our speed. The mountains are still high, the oceans are still deep, and the stars are still far away. We haven't conquered anything, we have only learned how to ignore the distance. You might believe that the modern world began with the steam engine or the internet, but the reality is much more haunting. You assume that we have always been moving faster and faster, A steady climb toward the light-speed world we live in now. But for 99.8% of our history, there was a hard, unbreakable ceiling on human ambition. From the moment the first Homo sapiens stood upright in the dust of Africa until the morning of September 27, 1825, no human being on this planet had ever traveled faster than the gallop of a horse. For over 297,000 years, the absolute limit of human experience was 35 miles per hour, a speed we reached only by partnering with a beast. We spent nearly our entire existence trapped in a world that moved no faster than a heartbeat, only to break that 300,000-year-old law in the final few seconds of our history. We didn't just speed up, we shattered the very definition of what it means to be a creature of the earth, leaving behind a slow-motion world that our bodies still remember, even if our minds have forgotten the weight of the miles. If this exploration of our ancient paths has changed how you see the ground beneath your feet, consider joining us for more deep dives into the stories that made us. What part of the human journey fascinates you the most? The land, the sea, or the animals that carried us? Let us know in the comments.